Hello there, ladies and gentlemen.
Hello. How are you?
I am doing good. There was a bit of surprise snow because Old Man Winter is not done with us in my neck of the woods, but other than that, I'm doing good.
Well, you spend so much of maybe they finally listened. You've been saying to stay frosty for so long that finally it paid off.
Yeah. I usually tell people to stay frosty because it's very easy to be indulgent in sentiment. And
I'm not guilty of that whatsoever.
as my mentor would often say, all you get with boiled water is just more hot air.
Good wisdom for all of us. Wisdom for all of us. So, well, it's great to see you, Monk. Thanks for coming and doing this with me. It's been, I don't know if you were able to hear the intro when I was first introing you, but we really appreciated how much you guys had, had given us a good deal of time and given us all that great critique and actually what I'm really excited about today is about what we're going to talk about is transporting characters into Flux Fantasy and exploring different ones and how that would work based on the system and based on characters that exist in the real world, like other characters from other universes that we can play around with. But I just wanted to open up, let you have a moment to give your thoughts and intro and things like that, and then we can go from there.
Oh yeah. So I see some familiar faces and I see some faces a little less familiar. So before I get into the subject matter, I will do a little bit of introduction to myself. My name is Mildra. I am the one and only gaming monk, though apparently in the Flux Destiny Discord I've also been known as the Ice Titan and the man who takes good morning personally. Mostly due to the fact that everybody thinks that when morning exists, I take that personally and want to fight it. Which, no comment. And
well, your morning tweets. I always love your morning tweets. I'm like, whenever you're saying good morning. So I think you're trying.
Yeah. It's that kind of mindset's inevitable when you're a few paces away from train tracks and have to deal with train horns every day. See, that's why I don't need an alarm clock. I have one outside my window. And it doesn't matter how well I soundproof it because it's full on trains. Anyone who's ever lived nearby, like an L train in certain areas, you know how it is. You can't hear yourself think. But I've been covering TTRPGs in one form or another on the channel that I do for over 10 years, and I've covered quite a bit in quite a few different forms. The main thing for me is not covering the big two affairs and leaning into RPG coverage in a way that reflects the kind of thing that got me into the hobby. It wasn't through an actual play, because actual plays didn't exist. It was through being able to mess around with IPs and the like that I was already familiar with, and doing so in ways that couldn't be done in other mediums like film, like television, like video games, and whatnot. And my introduction to Flux Fantasy was I was doing my bit of research because somehow I've become a journalist over all these years. And I happened to come across a game that talks about being able to create your OC. So I do a bit of digging around and I send an email to Chris on the matter, and the results of that, as Chris said, was the interview, and then the rest was history. Now, I will also note the Valley of the Judged is a series that I've been doing for a few years that is basically a segment-by-segment deep dive. Usually we try to go by chapter, but the way some games are formatted, that's not possible. And it is heavily inspired by the Let's Study series by J. Stephen Anyong, also known as The Life and Times of a Philippine Gamer, who was one of my major influences. Because what I do with Valley of the Judge, that's basically what he was doing for years with his Let's Study series. Even down to making example characters. And character adaptation has been a big thing, because that's something that I've explored in many forms in many different games. Whether it be the character threads in the old Wizards forums before that got shut down, in Giant in the Playground sometimes, in the Atomic Think Tank for Mutants and Masterminds before that got shut down. You might be noticing a pattern here. Or the massive archive with Hero System that was done by one Michael Serbrook, who's now running his own game, Prowlers and Paragons. One might ask, what would the point be of adapting existing characters in the tabletop if people are going to be making their own? The answer to that is quite simple. A baseline. Having a baseline or some sort of parameter to measure the stats of a given system can be done pretty easily with existing characters, because people already know what that character's capabilities are. So it's just a matter of putting the hypothetical into the mechanical. And for a lot of people, it provides an interesting challenge of how one would adapt a given character into different systems. And there are whole threads, whole websites, and whole channels and so on dedicated to this kind of thing. So when it comes to that pitch of being able to build your OC in TTRPG form with Flux Fantasy, that was one of the main things that brought my interest, and one of the main things I knew I wanted to put to the test. And if I'm putting something to the test, I'm going to be putting it through the ringer. As Chris can attest, if I'm testing on something, it's not just going to be a one-off. It is going to be a case of you're going to be running a marathon until until your legs feel like jelly, and then you're going to get told to run a few more miles. But with that in mind, I know a lot of people might think that transporting a character would be a relatively easy thing, and to a certain extent it can be. But it's also one that's fraught with a lot of pitfalls, a lot of traps. And in the words of Vincent Flanders, another one of my influences, the best way to avoid life's pitfalls is to watch other people fall in them. And I've seen plenty of people fall in the holes when it comes to adaptation. One of the big ones is assuming that you need to write a rule for every single power that a given character has. This is something that's a bit tricky, especially when you're dealing with characters who expand their power set with time, as well characters in most manga are going to do. Sometimes more frequently than others. A character in a seinen manga is going to expand their kit a bit more frequently than one a bit less frequency than one in a shonen battle manga. That's just the nature of the beast. And because of that, it's important to have a certain cutoff, a certain spot that you're doing that sort of fill in, and leave the possibility for expanding it if need be. But a lot of people have this idea of, oh, we need to write out each one of these abilities, like writing out a spell list. That is kind of redundant. You're putting more effort than is necessary in that kind of situation. What it should be more about is less on the letter of abilities and more on the spirit of things. Especially when you're dealing with systems that are not a one-to-one conversion. Now, this is one of those situations, and I kind of talked about this when I did the Valley of the Judged, where Flux Fantasy is in a unique position compared to other games. Because I've seen plenty of people try to adapt characters that have a more manga-esque bent with mixed amounts of results in other games. You end up with two scenarios. One is the freeform one, which has its own caveats and its own asterisks, where it requires a certain level of mastery of the system in order to make it work when it comes to that. A lot of superhero-based games are going to fall into this category. As I mentioned before, the Atomic Think Tank, which was a forum for the Mutants and Masterminds RPG. On the other hand, you have cases where the divide between your caster likes and your martial likes is a very clear-cut thing. A lot of fantasy games are going to fall into this category. But when you look at the characters in countless manga, that martial magic divide is not as clear-cut. And this is something that you see across popular media across Asia. And just look at any fantasy-based shonen or seinen character roster over the last, let's say, 30 years. There's not that many that strictly dedicate themselves to strictly martial or strictly magic. There's a lot of ones that are in between. And the Flux universe very much is in that vein. Just because somebody is, say, an escape artist doesn't mean that they shouldn't be able to get in close if need be. In fact, depending on how some people might build theirs, that might be the whole point. It would be very easy to look at say escape artists, ink fighters, and agents as the warrior, rogue, mage, holy trinity. But in practice, that is not the case. And in further practice, when you're doing these sort of adaptations, thinking in that kind of limited scope is kind of working at this backwards. It should be less about that and more about what the concept you have in mind is and what fits the closest equivalent possible. Obviously, a one-to-one is something that is just not going to be in the cards. So the spirit of things has to take precedent. And a lot of this is very general advice, yes. But it's important to lay down that foundation before you start getting into the specifics, before you start getting into the nitty-gritty of things. And fortunately with this, a lot of it can be handled through the combination of primary and secondary archetype through Flux Fantasy's setup. I have a bad habit of cross-wiring Flux Destiny and Fantasy. It doesn't help that they both are abbreviated as FF, and obviously there's my work. And Chris, feel free to chime in if there's any additional remark you have. But one of the big things. Good.
Oh, I didn't realize. I was like, why is my thing not working? I was actually saying things, and I was like, I didn't realize that something
You were
happened with my
muted the
computer
whole.
and screwed it up. I was muted. I was saying things. I was like, oh, I was like, oh wow, my stuff is landing really flat. I was just gonna say, well, let me just add on to your thing about the naming. That was engineered from the start just to trip you up, buddy. So that's my evil plan has been revealed.
Uh-huh. I will remember that. You.
But don't mind me. Keep going.
Yeah. I'm just saying you know all too well about my reputation and the fact that I got about a dozen notes this morning because of what today is saying. Don't prank me, bro.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. And for those of you who don't know that reputation, be thankful that you don't. I'll just say that there's a reason why I'm banned from the kitchen. Huh. But I would say to that end, it's important to nail down a concept when you're dealing with adapting. And a big reason why I focus on existing characters and how they'd adapt is, one, to push the system to the test, and two, because these are characters whose people who are familiar with those stories are already going to be familiar with on some level. And I know. And this brings me to another thing, and that is sometimes adapting by the letter of a given character kit is not possible, and it's best to either go by the spirit or look at something just as its function and what the equivalent might be. Since during the interviews with Chris, I brought up Full Metal Alchemist a few times. I'll use that as a case in point. For the purposes of statting, say, the Elric brothers within Flux Fantasy, the way alchemy works in an FMA proper is not as important as the final result, which is creating something from the environment. And that would be what you'd use as kind of the basis, and why in that kind of situation the escape artist with the very varied approaches that they have to karmistry would be the closest the closest approach, and within that, likely creative. Now, of course, that is one interpretation, and there may be others. I'm not going to claim that I'm the be-all, end-all when it comes to this sort of thing. And I'm pretty sure with enough time, there's people who are going to come up with new studies for the different types of karmistry use. But that is just one example. And obviously there's going to be plenty more examples that can be worked into in one form or another. But if I were to point out another major pitfall that people can have when adapting, I already mentioned, getting into the more granular end of things, but I'd say another is putting a round peg in a square hole. And this is why it's important to focus more on the spirit of something rather than the letter. I realize that I'm kind of going in circles with this, but some of this is important for that foundation. And I think where there's a unique advantage with Flux Fantasy is the fact that instead of having a lengthy list of effects, you have a set of effects that can be reinterpreted as you see fit in terms of how powers actually work. And and even more so the whole combo thing, which, take it from somebody who knows, I've seen plenty of games that try and do combos. A lot of them struggle with it. Or you end up having a whole column's worth of text just explaining how to do the combo. And because I see you unmuted, Chris.
No, no. Go ahead. You go ahead. I was gonna say something, but go ahead. I don't want to. You have a good flow going. I didn't want to interrupt you.
Yeah, but I said this during the Valley, but the way I see combos being interpreted is trying to embody the fantasy of, say, the multi-person techniques that you saw in like Chrono Trigger, where it wasn't some separate thing; it was an extension of what one could do. And admittedly, that's something that benefits from a simpler approach, because of the fact that you can't account for every potential karmistry and study that might show up in a given party. In some cases you can't account for people doubling down and having multiple ones of the same type. I don't think that's going to happen all that often, just because of how people create their parties, but it is something to consider. And in the case of Flux Fantasy, as everybody's seen, it all comes down to attack, defense, combo, signature, and locomotion. And that is pretty easy to interpret. And I'm looking at the chat. I see I'm saying I didn't realize I was deafened. What were you saying? Saying a bunch of stuff. Oh. And also I'm looking at my own chat and I see Vamp going into some of the games that he's familiar with. But
well, it's funny because the you mentioned the different functions in the game, attack, defend, locomotion, etc. Is that when I was designing Karmistry, it was looking at other major magic systems and looking how characters use their powers across different magic systems to do the various things. And when I sat and like outlined them out, like if I looked at Aang from Airbender, or Deku from My Hero Academia, or Ed from Full Metal Alchemist, or you just go down the list. You just go down the list of all these different magic systems, and you see how they have different modes. Okay, well, what can you do? What is, Aang can use wind, hit the air to, blow people away. He can create an air bubble to ride on. He can use that, that power to, attack someone, so there's all these different functions. And as I was doing that across multiple different characters, across different universes, with the objective of creating a magic system that you could basically create any power in, I had to kind of break it down that way, was to break down others and see, okay, what are the categories that you can nominally break down powers into, and create it in such a general way that it's not like a slog to recreate your character in this universe, but that you can literally plug it in and into those particular modes. Mm-hmm. So I'm glad you had brought that up, because that was actually something very deliberate.
Yeah, and it's funny you bring up Aang, because I've seen my fair share of TTRPGs trying to adapt the Avatar universe, whether it be unofficially like things like the Second Age or some of the D&D adaptations, or officially through Avatar Legends, which I know Avatar Legends has its fans. I am not one of them. I was very harsh on Avatar Legends, and the way it handled bending was to treat bending as if it was a move using Powered by the Apocalypse. But the problem is that even with just air bending, we see far too many ways and far too many potential ways that it can be used, that that having it as a move in that sense, even as broad as moves are interpreted in something like PBTA, isn't going to really cover it. And at that point, you're expecting the table to fill in the blanks. And I think I told you this before, Chris. But when you're having the table try and bail you out as a designer, um, you're in the Todd Howard camp of things, which ideally you should not want to be. Is the reason why Rifts and Palladium has been my whipping boy for over 20 years. Um, because of the fact that I have to house rule the hell out of that in order to make it work. When my house rules are as big as a normal book, we have a problem. But of course, the big reason I wasn't fond of Avatar Legends was, and you'll probably be able to help make sense of this. It was focused more on adapting the TV show and not the world the TV show takes place in.
Yeah.
I see in my own chat the Power Rangers RPG being brought up, and that had the same problem. And it's astonishing when that happens, because that was a problem that the Indiana Jones game back in the 80s had. It assumed that people would just want to play as the cast from the movies.
Right.
Even back then, it got roasted over an open flame for that. But I'd say it's a similar thing here. Nobody wants to play Flux Fantasy and play as Hugo per se. I know that you're doing that later on, but that is a special case. I'm speaking broadly.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I want you to continue that point because I think it's so important. You know, it's different to experience the characters you like exteriorly, right? And so that's different when I play Hugo, like in the game. But like, you want to. The whole point is so that you get to play yourself, play your own OCs, right? So it's a good point you bring up. So please keep going on that, because I think I like where you're going with it.
The analogy that I often make is nobody wants to play as Cyclops or play as Storm if you're running an X-Men game. What they want to play as is a character within of their creation that happens to be a student at the Xavier Institute, for instance. A long time ago, I was asked to run a Batman game. A game that would take place in Gotham City. And my solution to that was, nope, obviously having somebody play as Batman would just create problems. So instead, you were playing as what I called the Batman Irregulars. A bit of a nod to the Baker Street Irregulars from Sherlock Holmes. These were people who would be in the universe of Gotham City, would interact with the things within that world, but weren't playing it, but still had their own way to put their own stamp on things. And for those who haven't read Sherlock Holmes, the Baker Street Irregulars were basically Holmes's way to get info about the goings on in the city by paying a bunch of kids the equivalent of a nickel a day to act as his eyes and ears. I'm vastly simplifying, but that's because I haven't read Sherlock Holmes proper in I'd say at least 15 years. But the point is that building around the setting of a world is far more important. the building the canon characters is just there to provide a baseline,
Right.
a way to convert what somebody already knows with that character into the stats of a given game. It's also a good way to showcase what, say, the pluses mean regarding, say, talents in Flux Fantasy. But with but to use myself as an example, because the kit for what is known as Mildra is one that I've had and attempted to use in other systems for many years, and some of them certainly struggle with it unless they're going the more narrativist approach, which obviously that's not going to struggle with this kind of things, but it's not going to have the same kind of impact. Is the whole thing is not just ice, but the season of winter itself. That means making melee weapons out of ice, being able to control and move along gusts of wind, being able to use snow to blind. It's that sort of versatility. And with a lot of RPGs that come from a very wargame-like background where individual units are more like chess pieces, that's something that that kind of versatility is something that is going to be a struggle. And this is why that simple approach is going to be more effective, especially if we're dealing with characters that may come from video games, because of the way the options work in, say, a fighting game or an action game. But to further go in with that, obviously, I'd say with at least each karmistry and each study, there's example characters in different media that you can think of that would fit. But I think it comes down to the fact that, as well, that what form say attack takes place is up to a player's interpretation, and that interpretation, when it's broadly done, allows for a degree of variety. I don't have to worry about when it comes to the whole ice weapon thing that I mentioned previously. In some games, I have to think about what the individual stats are for each type of weapon, and I have had my character depicted with swords, axes, spears, staves, what have you. So going with all of those individually is a bit overwrought. Whereas in something like this, since it is just going to be an attack and it's up to me to interpret it, I don't have that same problem. Which may run counter to some of the things I've said in the past about martial characters getting the short end of the stick in some fantasy games. You all know which ones. I don't need to name names. But the name names anyways. The world's most ubiquitous role-playing game. All right, I'll name that one. Also known as the world's most litigious role-playing game. Also known as the reason why Hasbro will never answer any of my calls. But in this particular case, that is not as much of an that kind of martial characters getting the shaft is not as much of an issue, because the martial mage divide is not as clear cut. I mean, you could someone make an argument that ink fighters are meant to be akin to fighters or monks, maybe, but there's nothing saying that an ink fighter can't be using a weapon, or there's nothing saying that an escape artist can't be armed. That is ultimately a player decision. And to that end, and maybe this is something that you've already done when it comes to having people go through character creation during testing and the like. But I would imagine before anyone even starts putting pen to paper on the various stats within the system, you're asking people about the concept first. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's important. Like, I feel like it's even when I teach art class around here, I talk about the importance of, when I think, this is my personal philosophy, things like the stats, and that's all the window dressing at the end. You have to know the character and let that character, you have to really know the character first and let all of that flow into everything else. Yeah. As opposed to, okay, I'm going to sit here and figure out all these stats. Well, first, who's your character? Because then their powers and everything about them should complement who that person is. Mm-hmm. And then it carries, or otherwise it's upside down. And I actually think it's harder to do it the other, well, I don't know if harder is the right word, but it's kind of like it's doing it kind of backwards. I think the better way to do it, come up with your character, their background, their inspirations, their motivations, their fears, everything, and then have those help flow and inspire the different parts of who they are. I mean, obviously, when you take a character like Hugo and Marco, who are, Marco obviously leans toward creative karmistry because he's an artist. Hugo is in clockwork karmistry because he loves math and physics, and obviously that's an easy port over to that, right? So knowing those things about your characters help you realize, like, if you were going to take me personally and put me in this world, you're not going to want to put me as an ink fighter. I would make a terrible ink fighter. That's just not I would probably make a much better escape artist than I would an ink fighter. But my brother, on the other hand, is way more athletic than I am. Would probably make a better ink fighter than me. And and our interests are very different. Mm-hmm. So understanding your character, that's why we do things like all these, commissions and things that we do for people's characters to help them understand the character and then let that flow into the character power profile. Yeah. As opposed to the other way around.
Mm-hmm. And obviously I had a certain approach when I commissioned you for the design that I use within your particular style.
Right.
And as a bit of an aside, just speaking from a character design perspective on that. What was your initial impression when you saw that design in full?
When I saw the initial monk design from before I did it, you mean your original design?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it was what I saw was a lot of intent. What I loved about the character was that, especially when I saw him rendered across different artist styles, mm-hmm. There's an intent behind the character that inspired not only the stories about the monk character, but also the design. Was that there is this strength but calm that came from adversity. That it's not empty wisdom that the monk talks about, but it comes from his own experiences, and you can feel that through the character design.
Yeah, and obviously I'm not a character designer proper, but I've studied various characters. I did. It's funny that I have no formal training when it comes to character design or art, but I did a whole piece about why a lot of the superhero designs in several superhero movies just don't do it for me. And the word I used was over design.
Right.
Like that.
Yeah.
I think one of the big examples I used was the way Batman in the Arkham games had evolved into being fairly standard to being borderline power armor by the end. And
right, yeah.
I felt that was, for lack of a better term, over iteration. It's as if some designers were ashamed that they were writing or drawing for comic books and they needed to find a way to make it quote unquote realistic. Which, as an aside, few words would make my blood boil than that. Believability is more important than realism. Realism is boring. Okay, that's a bit extreme, but my mind goes back to the tagline from the original Superman movie. You will believe that a man can fly. And I think that is a good watchword to that line, which about believability over realism. It's more about making it so that the audience wants to be taken along for that ride. And to shift back into characters. Over my many years of covering RPGs, because I've been involved in the tabletop space in one way or another since I was 10. I started with the AD&D Black Books. After jumping in from Choose Your Own Adventure. That's my origin story. But there's two major schools of thought. There is you build the stats or pick a class first and then build a character around that. Or the reverse, which we really saw in the 90s, which is you build a concept and then build the stats around that concept. And obviously, something like Flux Fantasy is going to be in the latter camp. And anytime you're trying to adapt characters into a given setting, it has to be that. I've been recently reading the Record of Lodoss War novels, the ones that have been fan translated. Because the only one that's gotten an official English translation is the first novel. And I know some people know of Lodoss mostly through the anime. Both of the animes are only scratching the surface with that world. So I've been delving into that. And while it would be very easy to look at a character like Parn in Record of Lodoss War and say, it's just a fighter, that would actually be doing it a disservice. You know, it's one of those kind of things. And if I wanted to use a less magical example, something that instantly came to mind is the fantasy of the Grammaton clerics in the movie Equilibrium, if anyone here is familiar with that movie. For those that aren't, one of the big things with it was this idea of gun kata. Being able to master positioning to be able to fire with two guns at any target in a given area because you've been able to predict their positioning. So even shooting in the dark isn't a problem because you know how placement is going to work. Obviously, it's one of those things that stretches realism, but it scratched an itch for a lot of people, and I saw plenty of people trying to adapt that into systems, and it had mixed results. Especially when you're dealing with games that want to have you build the class first and then build the character. And don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with that, but it's a case of it has its downsides. And those downsides are something that you do have to be mindful of. But I've one of the shows that I do is a show called Geek Watch, which is a weekly podcast that is all about just talking about geek things. And a recurring motif on the show is what we call the Pick 5 challenge. Right, I have some of my colleagues pick five characters from a given work, or works. The rule is that you can't pick from more than two. You can't have two characters from the same source. And I have to adapt. And a lot of times I have to look at, say, a wiki entry and what the bullet points are, and then build around that in a kind of getting that spirit. But I think one of the trickier things that somebody might have adapting characters from other IP is payback, is the way karmistry works in Flux. And this is something I did give some thought about before I came on tonight. And I do think there is a way to handle it. And that is to interpret it in a figurative sense, instead of the more literal approach that payback has in the actual system. That being that using it is giving the GM ammo for interesting things to happen, because that is at the end of the day what payback is in a mechanical sense. You know, the more you use it, the more interesting things can happen that work against you. And an easy way to reinterpret that is the idea that using it is going to be drawing attention because you're doing stuff you shouldn't. That attention doesn't necessarily have to be from the great machine. It could just be from the local authorities, for instance. I mean, I suppose one parallel would be the way essence works in a game like Exalted. In Exalted, you have two forms of essence, which are essentially the game's MP: personal and peripheral. Personal is smaller, but you're not going to be drawing all that much attention. You have more points in the peripheral pool, but the more that you use it, the more obvious it is that you are an Exalt. First the caste mark starts glowing on your forehead. Then your particular key starts appearing. Then your anima banner starts appearing. And then that anima banner gets more and more blatantly obvious, to the point where people could see for miles that there is an Exalt doing something, since Exalts in that setting are essentially demigods. So when one's doing something, it is very, very obvious at that level. And even beyond that, you look at a lot of Magic systems in general, and you probably saw this as well. With a lot of them, there is always some sort of catch when it comes to how they work. To swing it back to Avatar, for instance, the main catch is you can't create an element from nothing. You know, even something like firebending, you still need oxygen to actually set stuff on fire.
Right.
And
I think it's the limitations that make it interesting. You know, is like, okay, well, it provides those hurdles you need, because otherwise you start teetering into, like, you know, okay, well, I'm a big, one of my favorite, like, creative philosophies is about, like, the the need for limitations, because they force characters to have to work around them,
Mm-hmm.
in their settings. So
Yeah. Though I will also argue that the limitation needs to make some degree of sense. That's why one of my big whipping boys has been the whole spells per day model that you see in the likes of D&D, because there isn't anything in universe to justify it.
yeah, that makes sense. I mean, what your argument makes sense.
I did a whole video of a couple months ago about it, and I understand that the big reason it's there is it is back in Chainmail, which is D&D's predecessor, which is more of a skirmish war game than anything else. Wizards were meant to be the artillery, like this, in the same position that an artillery in a war game has. Especially in like pike and shot kind of war games, or World War One or World War II style war games, which there were a lot of in the early 70s. That was what laid the groundwork for the TTRPG scene in the US. In Japan, it was a little different, but that's another story. But there was also the fact that Gygax and Arneson were big fans of the Dying Earth series of novels by Jack Vance. But both of those are external reasons, not internal. Internally, if I'm playing a game that is set in, say, Mystara, one of the original settings, why does a wizard need to memorize their spells every day? That is the question I have to ask, and I've never gotten a straight answer, which is why that model doesn't quite work for me. And I remember back then I'd have to come up with reasons as to why one of them being a tech fantasy setup where spells were literally cards that you'd burn in order to cast, so you'd have to go out and get new ones. And I'm well aware of stuff like Dragonlance, but that's probably because Dragonlance was a novel first before it was a setting. So you couldn't exactly get away with those external arguments. There's also the fact that it was written by Weiss and Hickman, who know what the hell they're doing. But other examples I've used are say the magic system that Shugenja use in Legend of the Five Rings. The reason it's limited is because you're not casting spells directly, you're asking the local kami to perform a service for you. And you can only do that so many times. And depending on what sort of where you ended up learning it, you're going to be better with some elements than others. This is, of course, going on the whole 5 elements thing, as the name kind of indicates. Legend of Five Rings, and of course the Book of Five Rings. Obviously, one of the most common limitations is using it tires you out, because that's something that people can easily see as a one-to-one thing, and this was played at its most straight with My Hero Academia, for instance, where using quirks was described as being akin to using a muscle. Using it is going to exhaust you, but using it is the main way you develop a bigger capacity to use it. And as a designer, that's enough to build a whole system around. And people have done that, developed by do kind of systems many times in the past. I've seen a lot of them. So there is that kind of strength in limitation. But I will go further that the limitation has to make sense, not just externally, make sense from a game design perspective, but also make sense within the world that's being portrayed.
Yeah, and that's why, like, for Flux Destiny, payback is supposed to represent the logical reason why payback exists is because obviously everyone's powers in the universe are, it's almost Matrix style, right? Where you're basically like Neo, where you can hack the universe to make it do things.
Mm-hmm.
And so in Flux Destiny, when you are messing with the Great Machine, you mess with it to affect what happens in reality. And obviously, the Great Machine does not like that for obvious reasons, because its job is to protect the integrity of the whole universe, right? If everyone started doing that with no consequence, the integrity of the whole universe would fall apart. So it's meant to protect what I call natural consequence in this world, you know? And so when people, and in this world, destiny means something. It's not just a concept. Oh, what's your destiny? Your is, you know, your hypothetical destination in time and whatever. Destiny has a very literal meaning in this universe. Is actually explained in the core rulebook here, that for anyone who hasn't gotten to this part yet, but it's destiny is the physical state of the world at any point. So when you're changing destiny in Flux Destiny, you are literally changing you know, the physical world, including your, you know, yourself. If you're using karmistry to you know, change your, for example, you know, Ella and I were talking the other day about taking some characters, and we're like, hey, if we took someone like look, she and I are huge Haikyuu fans. I've become a huge Haikyuu fan over the past couple of months, and I have been watching it, and I just got to this amazing episode that is just like, I cannot get over this episode. I don't want to spoil anything for people, but we were thinking, okay, well, how do you take someone like Shoyo and bring him into this universe, and what would be, you know, the payback result of it? And we were saying, okay, well, Shoyo would have to be probably a biochemistry escape artist, because he would use his powers to you know, modify his, you know, his own, you know, personal abilities, right, for high jumping and for you know, quick feet locomotion and things like that. But in doing so, now would Shoyo do it that way? You know, so in doing that, if he were to use karmistry to do those things as opposed to his natural physical talent, obviously payback would start catching up with him, because he's, you know, life hacking, right? Mm-hmm. To get those skills, as opposed to actually, you know, developing his skills to do that. So that's where I feel like in this universe it seems to make sense, which I think you agree with, is the fact that in Flux Destiny, payback makes sense, because it thematically represents the universe pushing back on you, trying to impose your will on it, right?
Yeah. And when it comes to parallels of that strong emphasis of fate, there's two manga that come to mind that come close as far as a fixation of fate. One of them is X 1999, the greatest manga that never got finished, for very, very obvious reasons. Mostly involving bad timing, given what was going on in Japan at the time. But the other one, and this might be a bit of a stretch to some. Thank you for the raid, Naki. Is JoJo, of all things. Now some might go, wait, are you trying to make a JoJo reference? Not really. What I am saying is that as that series has developed, fate has become far, far more tangible. And there's been several cases of people trying to control or even escape fate, and it ended up blowing up in their face. I'd say one of the biggest examples is Diavolo, who probably had the worst way to go out, in the fact that he is subject to death repeatedly over and over, and he's basically he is caught in a death loop. No, anytime he's about to kick the bucket, he ends up being put into a completely different scenario, and it repeats. Because he was someone who tried to completely think he could control his own fate. And the end result is quite literally a fate worse than death. And there's been plenty of characters throughout fiction who have tried to do the whole cheating fate thing, and you see the result, which does make it a very strong parallel that people can latch onto, because everybody's familiar with the concept of fate and how it's used in mythology, for instance. Some a lot more than others. Looking at you, Greece. And having a consequence that people can easily draw parallels to is equally important when it comes to making that consequence make sense. Again, this is why I kept picking on the Vancian model, because so much of the consequence only makes sense from a strictly game design perspective, which certainly has its place, but consider game design and consider the mechanics and the narrative as two ends of a taiji, or the yin yang symbol for those who are less familiar. You know, if you try and overemphasize one or the other, then the whole thing is lesser as a result.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I know for some that they romanticize the level of crunch or the level of realism, but that comes with its own price. Namely that it's a higher floor. But when it comes to, and hang on a sec, I had to adjust one small thing. When it comes to this particular setup, this also means that even if each character is a combination of palmistry and study, there has to be a degree of broadness with each, where it's more about a particular theme rather than a particular endpoint. Because I'd imagine one of the goals you had was so that you could have two people who had the exact same setup but don't use it the same way.
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly right.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you already kind of established that you have two escape artists in the actual story who aren't using escape artists, the chemistry from escape artists, in the same way.
Right.
I'm guessing because of that, that short list of inspiration was key for that.
The short list of I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand what you're asking.
Within the core book, there is a segment in each form of chemistry and study called inspiration for powers.
Oh, right. Yes. And that's exactly, yes. That's why that's there, right? It's to show that, there's so many different ways that you can apply this. That you can take because, kind of circling back to what we were talking about earlier with the different, creating a character, sometimes the hardest part is coming up with, well, what is because the world is your oyster, so to speak, and at least in this universe, mm-hmm. where you can basically, if you go to like the superpower wiki, for example, there's so many superpowers and so many different, it's there's a lot. There's a lot of ways and a lot of like nuanced, different versions of the same thing, right? And so I think people fall into one of two categories. Either they think too broadly, or not. I don't think the word "think" too broadly. What I mean is they're overwhelmed by the broadness of decision of choosing the power. There's just such a gigantic menu.
Choice paralysis.
And then some people who don't, yeah, exactly. And then the other ones who they don't think beyond, like 5 different categories, right? And so it's like, it's like, oh, okay, I can fly, or I can shoot lasers out of my eyes, and and breathe underwater, and that's okay, and I can jump high. Some people think like that, and then other people are on the opposite extreme. So and everyone is going to be. I'm on the extreme of, personally, I'm on the extreme of, there are so many choices and so many nuanced choices that I have a hard time choosing, and that's why I feel it's important to develop your character first, and then that will lead you down the path of making the right decision. But yes, that's exactly why we had put that page in there, was to show its versatility.
Yeah, and you
to encourage that. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
And you no doubt recall that one of the big things I kept getting on about with when we did the Valley of the Judged episode on Flux Fantasy was guidance.
Yes, I do remember that.
Because I will be honest, there is one genre of games that is on the low end of my coverage, interviews notwithstanding, and that is superhero games. That's not to say I dislike them or Universalist games, but they both run into the same issue of the sheer weight of options that they kind of have to do can become a problem. Can invoke that choice paralysis, and I often ask people how they address that issue, and some are able to address it better than others. With Universalist games, because they're meant to be more of a sandbox, they have a little bit harder of a time. But it is one of those elephants in the room that has to be dealt with. And I remember, when it comes to adaptation, I remember I was actually going back and forth quite a bit regarding what sort of ink fighter if I would adapt the Mildra character into in the Flux universe. And there were two that I was thinking of: Weapon and Elemental. And I had to ask myself, okay, what is more important, the whole being able to create weapons, or the winter aspect, or the full manipulating an element? And between the two, I went with Elemental. But mostly because of the fact that I felt was more key to the character. And if I were to pick just weapon, it would have limited the intent. So that's why I didn't go that route. But it was a hard call, I will admit, and it did take me a bit of time. And and once I had nailed that down, after that it was just a matter of building around the concept, which I think I did all right with the concept that I had sent Ella, which was a ink fighter who is doing it, who most of the time does not even need to use his ink.
Right.
Somebody who ends up kicking your ass, which would easily provoke the assumption that of course you kicked my ass, you're an ink fighter. Motherfucker, no, I'm not using it.
Right.
I'm just it's a case of.
But that was such an awesome part of the story that Ella had written, was at the end. I don't want to spoil your story for everyone else, but but when Monk has to use his power, when at toward the end, and it ends up being like a show of to the person who was fighting him, like, you made him use your power. You made Monk use his power. That's a big deal to get him to use his power.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you should take that as a badge of honor that you got him to do that, which is very cool, right?
Yeah.
To approach it that way.
And there's been a lot of characters in like shonen battle manga who have that motif of, oh, I wasn't using all of my power, or this isn't my last form, or now I'm gonna be serious, that kind of thing. My intent was to take that and do a spin on it, because I wanted to go with the idea of what if somebody has a very legit reason why he's not going full clip, and I'd say a very strong reason being, there is no off switch. It's either 1 or up to 11 to make the Spinal Tap joke. And that provides a good setup that even if somebody's on the back foot, it's a case of even if you only barely survive, you're barely surviving him with a massive handicap. Although I will admit, when I went through that story, there did seem to be a little bit of the wandering cowboy in the way Ella had wrote it.
There was a little bit of that, wasn't there? I thought it worked for him, though.
Yeah, it definitely worked, and I do have a fondness for that concept of the stranger coming into town and dealing with a problem before going on his way.
Right.
Or the guy who's coming in, who's not looking for trouble, but unfortunately trouble finds them.
Right.
Look, we've all seen a Western at one point. We've seen the guy who just wants to go in and get a drink, and somebody wants to start something. And that's how the fight starts.
Right.
But I would say that I would say in addition to that I do remember making the analogy with agents of like Men in Black or James Bond, but I'd say the agent is the perfect one for those who want to be the gadgeteer in their particular parties, the ones who always have the right tool for the job. And admittedly, that is something that can provide an interesting challenge. To bring out Bond, for example, you look at the kit that Q ends up giving him, and it's kit that doesn't seem all that useful at first. Like, oh, we have an Aston Martin with an eject button. Like, how useful is that going to be at first glance? But put someone in the right situation, and they end up being very useful with that. Now, granted, in Bond's case, there's the issue of not being able to bring any of the stuff back, but that's another story. Or to use a video game example, I'm a big fan of the Thief games. And within those, even though it has a decent sword fighting system in there, even if it feels a little clunky by design, you're not a master swordsman, you're not a fighter, you're a thief. And a large amount of the kit that you have in that is built around giving you better ways to be a thief. especially regarding arrows. Because one could look at a glance and say, "What, an arrow that generates moss on the ground that it hits? What? Why would that be useful?" Well, because when you're walking on moss, you're not making any noise. So, you know, you're not making any noise while you're sneaking around places you shouldn't be. And I bring that up because with the whole rockstar status that escape artists have, it can be easy to get tunnel vision about that. But it is just as important to showcase that there's ways to utilize the system that don't involve that particular angle. And same thing goes with the likes of Clockbot. In fact, I think for a lot of instances they would be an interesting challenge. Because of the
How's that?
Because of the fact that within their particular concept, essentially a karmistry based robot that's trying. A lot of people might think, okay, so only if you're adapting characters from other IPs, only robot characters should apply with that. Not always, because golems are a thing, and just as much as if someone wanted to interpret it, is any sort of non-natural kind of character, like say a djinn. Obviously, it's going to be a tricky thing to do as a one-to-one, but it is possible. And because I could see someone making a Alphonse analogy with Lockbots, but if I'm being honest, that wouldn't be my first choice. Because
I could. Yeah, go ahead. I want to hear your take on that.
Because the only thing in common with that is just somebody who could take a beating, but that's not enough.
Yeah, that's really, yeah. I mean, I could, and honestly, the only real parallel is just the metal skin. You know, that's really it. I mean, you could, if you were to take Alphonse and put him into this universe, you'd probably make him an escape artist too, and he'd probably have, or the way that he was applied to his armor was using quantum karmistry, something of that nature is probably what applied his soul to his armor. And so that's probably what happened. So the armor would not necessarily be a clockbot. I mean, you could create a clockbot that a soul was, I guess, attached to that way. I guess you could do it that way, but you wouldn't have to make him a robot. He can be a suit of armor, you know? Yeah. So that's an interesting one. I hadn't thought about his application.
Yeah. I mainly say that because one of my characters when I was playing a 13th Age campaign was what looked like a golem, but in reality was hollowed out. It was a spider operating from the inside, basically puppeteering a golem. So you literally had a spider version of a mech pilot. I think I got the idea because somebody made the old joke about three kobolds in a trench coat, and I thought, why did I run with that? As far as why I'd go with spiders, I flipped a coin. That's really all it came down to. And
so why don't we? So sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. I wanted to be sure that everyone had a moment to ask questions to Mildred while he's here.
Mm-hmm.
I have to duck out for about 30 minutes, but I will be back for Alan's panel in 30 minutes about the digital character sheet, which I know everyone's really excited about, and I can't wait for that to debut. And I hope Monk, I don't know if you'll still be around, but I would love for you to see it, because we'll obviously send it to you. But it's so cool.
Yeah.
But I want to turn the floor over. I'll duck out. Let Monk take your questions. You guys can totally ask him questions in the chat, and then in 30 minutes I will be back, and we will switch to the next thing. But Mildred, seriously, thank you. This was it's always fun, like deep diving with you in these things, and I know everyone really appreciates your expertise and thoughts on this. So I will gracefully bow out and let you continue your conversation and either continue to talk or take questions from the audience from there. All right, guys, I will be back in 30 minutes.
So, with that said, I think I will open the floor to those in the audience in the Discord, and also the people in my chat for particular questions. I will note that Cornelius over on my YouTube chat had asked if Paul Atreides from the Dune series would make a great character to adopt for Flux Fantasy. That's tricky, because covering Dune in general is tricky. Though, if I'm being honest, I think a character like Paul would be much better served in the actual Dune RPG rather than Flux Fantasy, if one was intent on doing so. Probably I would say probably as an escape artist, although a quantum type, just because of the way the weirding ways work in that universe, which I don't have enough drinks in the world to try and summarize. But for those of you in the Discord, I will open the floor to any questions that you might have. And obviously, for those watching on the stream and on my end, the floor is open there as well. And I do see some intense typing. Remember, punch the keys, for God's sake. Not a question. Rasslin Majere is better than any standard D&D wizard. Well, again, written by people who know what they're doing. So Boofby asks, do you have any advice if you're dead set on making a character, but it's just not coming out? Like, you don't know what you're doing wrong? I think in that kind of situation, obviously there's a lot of variables in the way that question is phrased, so I can't give a universal answer to it. What I can say is, in those situations, it's much like when you're in some sort of writer's block. It's best to stop, take a step back, look at the wider canvas, and see if you've been approaching the thing from the wrong angle. Even if you don't know what you're doing wrong, sometimes getting a wider perspective can help to find a solution. Yeah, sometimes it's a situation where you can't force creativity. Sometimes you do need to stop and think it over. I will use myself as an example with some of this stuff I was doing for our Final Fantasy project. One of the jobs we have is Magitech Knight, which originally was going to be a nod to the Magitech platforms in Final Fantasy VI. But I was struggling to find a way to make it work within the pillar design that we had set up. Until I sat... Originally, I was going to have it cut. Then I sat on it for a bit, and one day while I'm doing something else, I end up thinking, I already have a weapon master, why not make that an armor master? And once I figured that out, everything clicked and I was able to just run with that and keep the given job. Sometimes when you're in that kind of corner, sometimes you just need to step back, and sometimes you may need to hack off a limb in order to actually progress. And Katie says, not a question either, but Vi would definitely be an ink fighter. Got Arcane on the mind. I had Arcane in the mind, and then Season 2 happened, which was alright, but kind of a disappointment. But kind of putting too many plates on there. Look, if you told me Season 2 had a different set of writers, I would just nod and say, yeah, that makes sense. And a red flag for me is when a new season feels like it needs to introduce a bunch of characters. And for me, it wasn't an issue of game lore, it was an issue of just writing. A story like Arcane works at its best when you have a tight set of characters you're building around. Adding additional ones just to expand the world in that way. And I will admit I have a love-hate relationship with League of Legends. But that's mostly on the game design end of things. That, and I'm still salty about the removal of Dominion, even though that was years ago. But I could see Vi at... I know it would be very tempting to go with Ink Fighter, but given the fact that a good amount of her kit is those gauntlets, I would actually lean more towards Agent. Simply because with Agent, their big thing is overcoming their disadvantages through technologies, through Karmistry powered equipment. And in that regard, all the equipment that Vi has is equipment that is powered through Hex Tech, which allows it to be an easier parallel. I know it would be tempting to put her as an Ink Fighter because of her combat focus, but I think a bigger thing to keep in mind with someone like Vi is something that Eiko had said. You block with your face. Which, yeah, she does. A lot of her tactic is, I have more hit points than you. And it's for that reason that I'd be more willing to lean into that, especially since there are very blatant anti-karmistry agents, as well as just combat focused agents that can be worked with. And as far as which kind of study, bodyguard. Because even with all the electrical effects with those gauntlets, the big thing with the gauntlets is hit harder. And since close combat mastery is a subtype of the bodyguard study, and even more so martial arts, you have 2 and 2 there. And yes, I would also put Caitlyn as an agent type, not with the exact same kit. In her case, firearms. But definitely in a similar approach. Whereas Jinx is definitely a disruptor, a combat mastery heavy weapons disruptor, because there is nothing subtle about Jinx. But the key thing with that is you have the recurring thing of a lot of their extra normal abilities being things that come from their equipment. And that is the key point there. Like I said, I know it's easy to get tunnel vision regarding things like the escape artist and the ink fighter. But I feel like I think the other reason I'd go with that is the fact that with specialized equipment, even if it can do crazy stuff, it is like a program. It's meant to do that one thing and not a whole lot else, even if it can do that one thing very, very well. And things like the sharpshooting that you see with Caitlyn from that. The rifle is just a better rifle. Let's see, what if you got some normal people whose abilities almost border on supernatural, like the Power Rangers? That's gonna be a bit tricky, because Power Rangers / Super Sentai is a very wide net. You're dealing with a franchise that's been around since the 70s. And in some of the early ones, it was meant to be akin to power armor. In some of the later ones, it was a natural ability, like say magic in Magi Ranger. And in some, it's been a far more biological thing. Like say Dino Thunder. I would say with each of them, it really depends on what you're working with. If you're working with something like Mystic Force / Magi Ranger, then yeah, that's going to be Escape Artist. If you're dealing with something a little bit more tech based, like mentioning Go Onger, or something like Deca Ranger, that kind of thing would be better served as Special Agent. Especially in the case of something like Deca Ranger, where you're dealing with space police, so why not go with police? With Shinken. Yeah, and this is I've talked about this elsewhere, but this is the reason why, if I'm being honest, the official Power Rangers RPG actually got me angry, like raising my voice levels of angry, because of the fact that it talked about how this is the only Power Rangers RP, this is the only thing you need to run Power Rangers campaigns, but it's so clearly skewed towards early Zordon era, like season 1 MMPR. And if you're gonna be calling yourself a Power Rangers RPG, you can't do that. Because there's going to be some very pointed questions that are going to be asked your way, and you are going to have to answer them. But to answer Med's questions about Shinkenger, given the fact that using those symbols and what was referred to as Mojikara does drain a certain type of energy, and as tempting as it would be to say Ink Fighter, I think Ink Fighter would be far too specific. I think with Shinkenger they would be some variation of creative escape artists, especially in regards to how the mechs work in that setting. The only thing that makes me a bit hesitant is the disc when it comes to the sword, but that's something that can easily be worked with. The core, I would say, is still escape artist with that. And Boofy, I will note that even if they did call it the Mighty Morphin RPG, I still would have had problems with that, because they made the boneheaded decision to have Ranger colors be classes, like D&D style character classes. But it was clear that they were building around the original MMPR with that concept. So you end up with some stupid things like assuming every blue in that system is going to be Billy. Who's going to be the smart guy. Not every blue in Super Sentai or Power Rangers is the smart one. And Ornelia says, "What do you think about somebody like Captain James T. Kirk would be an okay fit?" With Kirk, I see him as a agent, but one that is less reliant on any sort of gadgetry and more on their way to talk out of situations. Because at the end of the day, he is a diplomancer. So I'd say negotiation mastery and more specifically diplomacy. Now, if we're talking about other captains in the Trek universe, then things get a bit tricky. I would put Picard in diplomacy expert. I would not put Cisco in that. I have seen Cisco's form of negotiation, namely punch. No, with someone like Cisco, it would be field leadership. Because more than any other captain, Cisco was very much a soldier. He was one who could be diplomatic, but because of his background, that's where his leaning and his mindset very much leans towards. Much to the chagrin of some people who hyper focus on ideas with Trek. And Met says, and here comes Cisco with the steel chair. You're not completely wrong. I mean, the one time Q showed up on Deep Space Nine, he got punched in the face and never showed up again. Whereas Picard was talking with the guy for years, and even in his old age, couldn't get rid of him. obviously when you have multi-role characters, it's more you have to eventually lean into one thing and focus on that. Uh, and because of that, there can be an argument for multiple roles within Special Agent for somebody like Kirk or Cisco, but I think about what those characters are most known for, and that's the kind of thing that comes to mind. You know, Kirk is very much an explorer mindset. Cisco is very much a soldier. The ultimate case in point being the Dominion War story arc that he was chiefly involved in. I'm not going to do a massive summary on that, but the point is that that's enough of a foundation to build around. And I feel like the choice of artistry and study should be what the biggest piece of the proverbial pie of that character is in terms of their overall kit. Sometimes that is going to be interpretive, and sometimes it's going to be even more abstract. But as long as there's that foundation, that's where you can kind of build things around. And I'm obviously not going to do it tonight because there's not enough time, but down the road I may consider doing a version of the Pick 5 challenge with Flux Fantasy. If I do so, I'm willing to let everyone in this Discord participate as long as they follow the rules. The rules being, you're limited to 5 characters. No more than 2 characters can be from the same source. So no more than 2 from the same show, from the same writer, from the same author, from the same genre in some cases. And the third rule is these are characters that I have to at least be able to see a reasonable wiki on. On the off chance that it's a character I'm not familiar with, I'd need to be able to do a basic level of digging. The rule of 2 thing that I have there is to encourage variety so that people aren't just taking the cast of one particular show and just dumping that on me. Although whenever I've done these, one of the key rules that I have is until the day of, I do not want to know what the picks are, because I want the experience to be as fresh as possible. There was an incident where we did this in the past, and somebody blabbed, and I told them, throw out your list and do it again. Because I don't want to know until I call your name in advance. But keep in mind, that's if I do it. Obviously, any names that are brought up here, as far as adapting, I'm not going to put in as a factor for that, because I don't even know, 1, if I'm going to do it, and 2, when I will, and I'd have to give people plenty of time to put in their entries. Like in that kind of hypothetical, I'd either have Chris or Ella handle the entries for me, and then have them not say it. You know, just because I want to have to come up with it on the spot. If I'm told in advance, even if it's only briefly, then that's enough time for me to prepare the idea in my head. And the whole idea is putting both the system and my own abilities to the test. Which is why it's best to be on the spot with that kind of thing. But it looked like Ella was saying something for a moment. Oh, I see the intense typing. Right. And depending on the keyboard, I could probably hear the intense typing. What can I say? I like typewriters. If I had the ability, I'd find a way to make my keyboard look like an old-school typewriter. Katie's saying I have a typewriter keyboard. Does it make the ding every few strokes though? And Maz, I don't know why I said it as Maz. Ella pointing out, and yeah, and yes, while I am at it, I will link my particular socials and put that in the Discord for you all. Yeah, is it a I know Moose is saying shameless plug, but is it shameless if you have no shame to begin with? Now these are things. It's even more shameless, like squeaky clean shameless. I feel like that's a contradiction. Like, how can someone be shameless and be squeaky clean at the same time? I suppose that's one of those great mysteries of the universe. But with the... Oh, looks like we got one from Matt. Would you mean like innocent? Maybe. Well, I'm reminded of the saying that there's no such thing as innocence, just degrees of guilt. I'm just saying, whenever somebody claims that they're innocent, I have my doubts. Or when they claim that they're a good boy, I have my severe doubts. Well, with Boopy saying I'm a bad boy, and to that I say that's probably the most honest thing you've said in the last 24 hours. And I'm getting the glare. Is neutral boy an option then? Unfortunately, no. You all should be familiar with binary morality in games. This is operating under that kind of metric. He goes, okay, I choose Koas. I know you meant chaos, but you wrote it as Koas, so that's what you're stuck with. But before we get into the wrap up, does anyone have any further questions that they'd like to ask? Because it's going to be a while before I do another one of these, and I'm not going to be doing one of these for the last part of the setup. And welcome back, Chris.
Well, thank you so much, Monk, for doing this. Mm-hmm. I really appreciate it. I think for the next event to start, I have to actually end this one. So I hate for everyone to have to like leave and then have to come back in, but for the event to actually kick into the one that's on the schedule, I have to actually close this one down.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you. In the minute or so we have left, I just wanted to thank you again so much for, uh, coming here and doing this. And I'm so thankful that this creating Flux Fantasy brought us together, a year ago or so, whenever we first did this, because, your insight has been valuable. I know the folks in the community really love you and love listening to your insights. And I deeply appreciate how much of your emphasis is on bringing light to new things, to new projects, and new things out there. So I'm giving you I'm giving you a round of applause, but I know you can't hear it in the audience. But I know that there's a virtual one, a virtual one going on.
Definitely appreciated, and and any messages, any questions, I'm always open for a few words here and there. But with that said, I'm gonna do the wrap up on the stream end of things. So,
okay.
I will note for those watching on stream, tomorrow I will be interviewing Alexander Johnson on his Wildwood TTRPG, which is giving me a lot of Mouse Guard flashbacks, which is always nice. And Thursday and Friday will be the return of Valley of the Judge. Thursday with Brother Monarch, and Friday with Brother Sieg. Respectively covering Shroud of the Ancients and the Japanese TTRPG Tokyo Nova, which is one that uses cards for those who are curious on that. And of course, there's plenty more stuff that I've got coming down the pipe. But until then, on behalf of the good brothers present and not present, my name is Mildra. I am your gaming monk. Stay fucking frosty, everybody.
Amen.